Hello, everyone. Welcome, welcome, welcome. So for those of you who were here last night or who watched the lecture online, it was a phenomenal lecture and a wonderful exchange. We had lots of energy came out of the room, I think. And we're eager to repeat this today. So I'm just going to introduce our moderator, Caitlin, and she will introduce our speakers. So Caitlin Rosenthal is a historian of 18th and 19th century US history. Her research focuses on the development of management practices, especially those based on data analysis. She works at the intersection of qualitative and quantitative methods to understand business history, economic history, and labor history. Her first book, titled Accounting for Slavery, Masters and Management, which came out with Harvard University Press in 2018, won the Simpkins Award of the Southern Historical Association, as well as the first book prize of the Economic History Society. So thank you, Caitlin, for moderating this panel. And I am so excited about the discussion that is to come.
Thank you for that lovely introduction, and especially for this introduction to be part of such a wonderful and interdisciplinary panel. When I was preparing my introductions, Marianne said that I could have a little bit of liberty to personalize, which I thought I would take advantage of the fact that we had already had one introduction so far. I will say briefly that Professor Orlando Patterson, who's I'm sure already known to many of you, is the John Cowles Professor of Sociology at Harvard. He is the author of 6 major academic books, of 3 novels, and of countless articles, and a long, long list of prizes. The 2 things where I wanted to personalize, the first, I guess, is not so much personal to me as it's coming out of the reading that we did to prepare for today's session, in which Professor Patterson reflects on what it means to be a public intellectual. And reading that description of what his work aspires to do, I couldn't find a better description of what it has done. His work, as he writes, and I will paraphrase slightly to make clear that it has been done, is that his work enlightens some of the big issues of our time, such as freedom, democracy, and equality. It helps readers come to terms with the great evils of human history, such as genocide, slavery, colonialism, racism, classism, and colorism. And it helps people to be honest about how the past works in accounting for present outcomes. And I thought in particular that use of that word accounting, which is what I study myself, is figuring out how to account for the past and how to change based on it. And the little bit of personal inspiration I'll take is that I quote Professor Patterson very, very often. It's a phrase from a 1979 article in the New Left Review, where he describes the period of slavery that I study, which of course is not all slaveries in all places, as merely capitalism with its clothes off. And that's a phrase that has not only kind of been mobile in my own work, helping me to think in new ways, but has helped me turn around the way I ask questions about slavery and capitalism. Turning this around to think not just about what capitalism and slavery can tell us together, but what slavery and the history of slavery more broadly can reveal about capitalism and its flexibility and the power relations that it covers up in most broad terms. So thank you for that phrase and also for the inspiration. We're going to start not with Professor Patterson, but with 2 prepared comments, and then we'll turn the floor over to him to respond, and then to all of you for comments. First, Daniela Cammack is an assistant professor of political science here at UC Berkeley. Her work focuses on democracy and its history in ancient Greek, and her book manuscript, Demos, How the People Ruled Athens, argues that the meanings and practices of democracy are marked by relations of domination. Professor Cammack will be followed by Ricarda Hammer, an incoming assistant professor joining us this summer in the Department of Sociology. Her work is at the intersection of global, historical, and post-colonial sociology. She received her PhD from Brown University in 2021, and her book manuscript is titled Citizenship and Colonial Difference, The Racial Politics of Rights and Rule Across the Black Atlantic. The book aims to build a new genealogy of rights formation by examining it through colonial struggle from the perspective of the enslaved and colonized in the colonial Caribbean. So I will begin by turning it over to Daniela for her prepared remarks.
Thank you so much. Oh, wow, that's very loud. Great. I think everyone must be able to hear me. Is that correct? Good. Thank you so much, Caitlin. It is a huge honor and pleasure to be here, to been asked to take part in this roundtable discussion. I think it's about 20 years since I first read some of Professor Patterson's books when I started my graduate studies at Harvard. And going back to them in the last few days has been even more exciting, actually enlightening and pleasurable than the first time around. They're so rich, and I'm so full of respect and admiration for the work that you've done. Thank you so much. So there are so many things that I wanted to flag as points that I find so compelling in the writing that Professor Patterson has shared with us today. So, for example, freedom conceived as power. I find that very persuasive. The lack of any kind of Platonic form of freedom as a concept. Also the thought that it doesn't exist kind of universally in the hearts of men, but rather as something constructed. I was thinking about Elaine Scarry's distinction between the made up and the made real, and thinking that freedom is something that has been made up and has subsequently been made real in the forms of discourses and the institutions that it's kind of worked to congeal, kind of coalesced around it. Yeah, not found everywhere on the globe, but is a distinctive value within the Western tradition. I take that very seriously. I fully agree. And I was so pleased to discover something that I hadn't fully realized before, was that so many of your intellectual heroes I really look up to and admire. So we were just talking about Moses Finley. I'm half British. In the British tradition, E.P. Thompson and Eric Hobsbawm. These are people that I also really revere. And the early Marx, of course, is a huge touchstone. I wanted to ask, there are so many things actually that come up in my teaching, and I was thinking, wow, I could really take advantage of my few moments here to ask your opinion on some of the things that I tell my students. I'm like, what do you make of this? I selected two general issues that come up in my writing and in my teaching that really touch on a lot of the arguments that you make. So one is to do with power, and the kind of power that the ancient Greek demos had, and that maybe ordinary people would need to have in other contexts in order to be free, or when free. And another kind of interest of mine is also going to be what to make of passages when the demos is itself represented as being a slave, how to think about those. So those will be the two kind of main issues I want to think about. So in terms of the kind of power that the demos has, or had, when being free, being eleutheros, Professor Patterson, very sensibly distinguishes between the kind of positive understanding of freedom, the positive power to do things with respect to oneself, others, society. Also associated with the idea of being empowered or autonomous, as distinct from kind of negative power to resist compulsion, and a third kind which he glosses as public power and associates with participation and equality. I was very interested and pleased and very delighted to see your use of Émile Benveniste, his work on the concept of kratos, the term kratos. I also followed him in my work, and I think his historical account of the kratos has kind of as a form of power that obviously is really important for us. It's the kind of power that is found in the term demokratia, demos and kratos. People often talk about that as people power, or kind of people ruling, rule by the people. There are different ways of glossing it. And I wanted to kind of probe a little bit your take on kratos as a form of domination. You mentioned this in the extract from the forthcoming book, The Short History of Freedom. And I take that very seriously. I've also written about kratos as a form of domination. I read it as really a kind of prevailing power. It's the power to prevail over others, is how I understand it. And I wondered if in your mind, when you think of the demos having kratos, are you thinking of the demos having power over others, others being douloi, being slaves in the first instance, possibly allies in an empire? And what do you make of the claim that I would want to put to you, which is that possibly the most important form of kratos that you see in demokratia is the domination of the demos over the elite, over the political elite, that may actually have been for the ancient Greeks the most important group over whom they would need to dominate. The demos, ordinary people, would need to dominate in order to be free. I think we can see that in the history of democracy, and I would really value your impressions of that. I also wondered about then the relationship between kratos as prevailing power, the power to dominate, and a couple of other Greek terms for power, because we tend to use that one term power, in many, many different senses, of course. But the Greeks, I think, the ancient Greeks were much more differentiated in their understandings of different kinds of power. So kratos, the power to prevail, seems very different from being kyrios, being authoritative or being an authority. And that is another kind of power that the demos has within Demokratia. It has the power to control, kind of sovereign power. We can think of it as kind of sovereign authority. That's a slightly different form, but I think also a very important ingredient in their conception of eleutheria, of freedom. Mm-hmm. And another kind, again, is arche, which is more like empire or sway or really office holding. Usually in ancient Greek democratic texts, you don't find the demos talked about as having, as archening. There's a couple of examples very early in the late 5th century, but by the time you get to the 4th century, to have arche is really understood as being the kind of power that an office holder has as an individual, very distinct from the idea of power that the collective has. And the demos is always the collective. So I kind of wondered if these different conceptualizations of power map on in any way to the ideas you have of power within freedom, or if they feel actually very different from some of the arguments you've been making. So that's one kind of set of issues and thoughts. So the second set of issues and thoughts I had was these passages where the demos, we find the demos represented as itself being a doulos, itself being a slave. Actually, often it's with the use of the verb. So it's often the demos is douleoing. It's hard to know how to translate that. I've struggled with it ever since I first started learning ancient Greek. I wanted to kind of say that slaving away is one possible translation, or you could also just say serving. So the idea of the demos serving the elite comes up over and over again in our texts, actually. Again, from the late 5th century onwards, but for example, in the old oligarchs text, there's several mentions of the demos serving the elite, or risking having to serve the elite to do leo again, if they didn't kind of keep the upper hand over the elite. You also find it in Aristotle's Politics. He says there flat out that if the demos does not have the power to elect office holders and hold them to account, then it is nothing but a doulos, or would be nothing but a doulos, a slave, and a polemios, a kind of hostile internal enemy. So these passages always put me to some trouble when I'm teaching, actually, because the students very naturally want to know kind of what is being said about the demos here. Is the idea that the demos, without its political power, before Solon's reforms, it often comes up here, because before Solon's reforms, the demos is described as edouleosen to the gnorimoi, so serving the nobility, serving the nobles. And they want to know, are we being told here that all the members of the demos literally were slaves? They were douloi to the elite? Or are we maybe being told that kind of en masse, they were conceived as dominated by the elite to such an extent, maybe they're constantly risking being turned into individual slaves with individual masters among the elite? Or is there some other way of understanding this? I've always wondered, are we meant to understand, do you think we're meant to take those passages literally, or maybe more metaphorically, that the demos is kind of being glossed as a slave or framed as a slave when it doesn't have full political power? Is that a metaphorical usage of the notion of doulos? Or might it be that it suggests that there was kind of always a very political, what we would call a very political component to the notion of slavery from the very, very earliest text, that maybe the paradigm of the individual slave, perhaps in a household, in an oikos, serving one particular master, maybe that's not in the entire, foundational paradigm, but maybe there's a sense in which there's a kind of collective enslavement, maybe of the class, of kind of, I'm thinking of Marx, kind of the class enslaved to the many, to the elite. Is that the way we should be thinking about that? And then the final question I have on that theme would be something like, would you think that there is maybe a collective equivalent to your notion of social death? So as I understand it, that kind of is operationalized at the level of the individual, that the slave within a household experiences this kind of natal dishonor before they're in a household, but also. But is there an equivalent at the collective level? Or would that be slightly to kind of misconceive or misrepresent the relations that you see obtaining between these different groups, the dominated and the dominators? Thank you so much. I've so much enjoyed visiting your work and the new work. It was a privilege to read some of the new work that's coming out.
Yeah.
And I can't wait to see the full
Thank
version.
you. Thank you very much.
Okay. All right. So thank you, Mario, Julia, and everybody else who was involved in putting together this really extraordinary conversation. I am overjoyed, really, to be in community with you all, finally. And it is such an honor to have this conversation with the Orlando Patterson. It is so nice to meet you, if a little surreal. But thank you for sitting down with us and engaging us. So I wrote my comments to keep myself on time. Now, it is fitting that the starting point for our discussion on Patterson's writings on freedom is a biographical dialogue. His life experience in the Caribbean is a vantage point that shapes much of Patterson's opus, for it is a site that encompasses so many of the contradictions of the modern world. Much like C.L.R. James, who positions the Haitian revolutionaries not as particular, but as world historical actors, Patterson shares with many intellectuals in the Caribbean tradition the ability to think from the Caribbean, but to give us a perspective on the world. In fact, in this interview with David Scott, Patterson explains that it was a celebration of Empire Day that brought inspiration for his monumental study on freedom. A young boy in colonial Jamaica, he was submerged in the unofficial anthem of the British Empire, Rule Britannia, and its bizarre chorus, quote, "Britons never, never shall be slaves," which struck him as, he explains diplomatically, strange. Now, this invocation to articulate freedom through its antonym will eventually lead Patterson to theorize the twinned emergence of slavery and freedom in Western culture. Indeed, from the position of the colonies, he is able to see clearly the components of the nature of freedom, one of which is the power to dominate others. It is no accident, he says, that the American Revolution is fought by a set of slave owners. And indeed, British settlers in the West Indies were particularly intent to claim their, quote, rights of Englishmen, precisely because they're insistent on their freedom to dominate others. Now, Patterson claims freedom as a sociological topic of study, meaning that freedom is not an ideational product of the European intellectual's mind, but rather it is culturally and historically situated, and it comes out of a particular social constellation, and that is the institution of slavery. Freedom, then, is not a universal value, but it emerges and gets institutionalized peculiarly and in unlikely ways in Western culture through its emergence out of slavery. For historical sociologists, Patterson offers a methodology for how to situate concepts, not as free-floating abstract ideals, but as products of particular social institutions. For example, the second component of the triad of freedom emerges in the struggle of the enslaved, perhaps best epitomized in manumission, the release from slavery, which is the struggle for absence of domination. I'm quoting Patterson. Freedom began its career as a social value in the desperate yearning of the slave to negate what, for him or her, or for non-slaves, was a peculiarly inhuman condition, end quote. And he then traces the struggle from ancient Greece, Rome, and continuing through its Christian reformulation. Freedom follows from slavery, from death to rebirth, slavery to salvation. In short, I quote, "Out of evil cometh hope." Now, Patterson really stands alone in his mastery of these topics in sociology, and this work has opened up the space for us to engage these topics as sociologists. But it'd be really boring if I didn't at least try to challenge you. So here goes. Now, my questions have to do with the distinction between the ancient and the modern world, and whether in the modern world after 1492, with the onset of the colonial project, freedom is mediated by who gets to be human in the first place. Take the temporalities of slavery and freedom. Out of evil cometh hope. What happens when manumission is not the absence of domination, but the imposition of a new form of domination? In other words, what if abolition is not the antonym of slavery, but the beginning of something else? Abolition in British Jamaica, for example, invoking the historian Thomas Holt, posed for the British Colonial Office the, quote, problem of freedom. For the Colonial Office, abolition required an investigation into the nature of the enslaved, specifically whether people would work without slavery. Indeed, this colonial report concluded that, I'm quoting, "Slaves, if emancipated, would maintain themselves, would be industrious and disposed to acquire property by labor," end quote. So applying a Pattersonian methodology, one that sees freedom as culturally inflected with meanings and socially situated, it becomes clear that freedom after abolition is the freedom to work. Of course, that freedom in liberal England is a scam we've known since Marx's Satanic Mills. But my point is that with abolition, re-emerged an older question, which is this debate over the anthropological nature of the newly freed. And this debate was not only centered on work, but also sought to answer more foundational questions over their disposition, their souls, the minds of the newly freed. Missionaries, as Catherine Hall made clear in Civilizing Subjects, insisted that the formerly enslaved were reformable, only to then lose this battle with the rise of polygenist racist science of the 1850s. By then, the British Colonial Office concluded that the formerly enslaved were indeed fundamentally different. So to understand slavery and freedom in the modern world and in the colonial context, don't we need a mediating concept, which is that of personhood? What kind of person could be free, or who could be a person at all? As you note, John Stuart Mill is outraged at the British colonial state's violent response after the Morant Bay Uprising, and yet Mill finds absolutely no problem with the imposition of Crown rule in 1865, because, quoting his On Liberty, "Despotism is a legitimate form of government in dealing with barbarians, provided the end is their improvement," end quote. Now, I think Jamaican intellectuals are leading the conversation of new genealogies of freedom. Alongside Patterson, Sylvia Wynter, Anthony Bogues have also undertaken this work, and for them, colonialism throws a wrench in the story. Take Wynter. 1492, she argues, ushered in the articulation of those who self-articulated as human versus those colonial intellectuals designated as outside of the human community. A community under God versus those without souls and hence heathens, the political community of rationality versus those incapable of it, or we might say, in this case, the community of laboring, responsible subjects versus those who are not reformable. With debates in modern Europe emerged a conception of personhood, designating the colonized as outside it, and thus foreclosing any discussion of the simultaneous, coetaneous existence of slavery in the plantation colonies. how else do we explain the apparent cognitive dissonance in someone like Benjamin Constant, who was very much thinking about liberty in relationship to ancient slavery, but in 1819 wrote, as Barna Hesse pointed out, seemingly without any irony at all, that, quote, thanks to commerce, to religion, to the moral and intellectual progress of the human race, there are no longer slaves among European nations. End quote. Now, finally, Patterson is an intellectual in the world, engaged in politics. So I must mention the third part of Patterson's triad of freedom, which is freedom as participation and equality. If, as Du Bois remarked, the slave stood for a moment in the sun in periods such as Reconstruction, then at the same time, Reconstruction saw the realigning of capital and the reshifting of racist ideologies to tighten the borders of the political community, leading Du Bois to conclude that this very failure of Reconstruction led to the failure of democracy in America. With the limits of abolition and Reconstruction, my question to you then would be if it is not only slavery that needs to be explained, but also the limited ways in which freedom was instituted. All right, so thank you so much for republishing this book and for rekindling these debates. I look forward to our conversation. Thanks. I think you're
Okay. Well, thank you very much for those extremely stimulating comments, but in many ways very provocative and raises issues which I've often thought about myself. I keep going back to my work and rethink what I originally thought, often based on not just criticism, but things I've read later on and from discussions of this nature. And you've certainly raised a lot of very interesting issues which are of the sort which leads me to rethink. For me, ideas are always open and nothing is ever closed. And including the possibility of completely rethinking what was thought before. I mean, I always hold that possibility out. I think the issues you raise about power is a very, very important. I often find real resistance to the idea that power is central to the notion of freedom, for the simple reason that liberalism tends to sort of see it as the opposite of freedom, rather than being, in a sense, the defining principle. But that's just a sort of form of way of hiding, as I tend to see liberalism as a kind of elaborate camouflage of the principle of power, because what is being said is that what's important, what's central, of course, is the escape from domination. And that's why, and David Bryan Davis's work is sort of, in a sense, I see the essence of his work, is that the centrality of the abolition movement to liberalism was indeed, it made that point, right? Quintessentially, freedom is sort of getting rid of slavery and doing that. So, but what is it camouflaging? It is camouflaging the idea that there is a form of power which remains central to the idea of freedom right through up to today, which is being camouflaged all along. And that is, of course, property. So, Marx, in a favorite passage, once made the argument that what happened with modernity involved the transition from the control of power of property through the control of people directly. That's what serfdom was about, to a condition in which we control people through our control of property. And that's what is being camouflaged in that terrible truth. One of Marx's most powerful readers is what's being camouflaged with the obsessive emphasis only on the idea of freedom as negation of personal of the power over another, because it remains almost it's too embarrassing and revealing to see this other dimension. But of course, as I pointed out, I mean, American history itself sort of makes clear the centrality of power, not only in the importance of property, which is being camouflaged, but directly in the fact that half the nation went to war to defend the principle of freedom as power over others. That's what the Civil War is about. This, you know, I mean, so the idea, and the Southerners were quite explicit about this. They're fighting for their freedom, it befuddled many people, but it shouldn't if they knew their history. Because in fact, I mean, the South has a history of Europe on its side. So I found your comments extremely useful. I mean, the idea, the notion that the demos as a slave. I just wondered whether, you know, that expression and that image and that thought, that metaphor, is a powerful one which persists right through. So in a sense, the Stoics took it up in the notion of the ultimate freedom was in fact surrender and complete sort of enslavement to God, to the power of the universe. In Roman thought, of course, it is significant that, and this comes out in the famous biography of Augustus, that ultimately surrender to the emperor, enslavement to the emperor was the ultimate freedom. And the Romans, the freedmen of Rome, the elite freedmen, sort of who the ones who subscribed to the Lares cult, which was the cult of the emperors, saw their freedom as guaranteed and invested in being the slaves of the emperor. And that idea, of course, was picked up in Christianity and became central to, this is why I think Paul has a solution to many of the problems of freedom. People, you should all read Paul. I mean, he was a very strange man, but maybe the most brilliant thinker, certainly the most influential thinker in the history of the West, whether you're a Christian or not. So the two great letters, you know, the letter to the Galatians was freedom in simple negation. You know, this is what Christ's death simply brought you out of enslavement to sin. That the metaphor was direct. The introduction was direct. Jesus paid for you to be manumitted. In fact, the people don't seem to know that the word redemption comes from redemptive, which literally means to buy someone out of slavery. So Jesus bought you out of slavery in the negative sense. But in Romans, and theologians spend so much time pondering about sort of, how you can reconcile Paul's letter to the Romans and Paul's letter to the Galatians. I never saw a problem, because what he then did was to shift to the notion of freedom as slavery to God. And of course, he said it quite clearly. And he got that straight out of Stoicism, by the way, who got it straight out of the Greeks. So that's how that extraordinary idea, which became central in Christianity. So, one of the most difficult and profound passages in the entire New Testament was when Paul sort of describes the experience of, and people have always said, what is he saying? How could he have moved from Galatians, which sort of, was literally goes on about the freedom of women, of Gentiles and so on. That this is what Jesus' death presented to an idea which is very much this sort of more Augustine idea of freedom as surrender to God. But it all goes back to the Greeks, and I said, so that sense of surrender, of freedom coming from surrender to a powerful force, which is, which can be conceived of as the state, if you like, and is how I would I see that, the origin of that idea, and it, of course, it tracks right through Western history, through Christianity. And by the way, the reason why I think Christianity is so important is that it's Christianity that carries Western ancient thought and ideas of freedom. People often see a break in the history of freedom, with the collapse of Rome, but it's nothing of the sort. I mean, the point is that these ideas were powerfully encapsulated, although interjected, in Christian doctrine of freedom. And it's often, especially philosophers, tend to sort of see Christianity, oh, that's religion, so that's not, that's ridiculous. I mean, it was the most important thought there is in Christendom. And as Cantatrius and others have pointed out, in many ways, modern thought was simply the extrusion, if you like, or the opposite of introjection, the extrojection, the turning out of the spiritual back into the secular, in the same way that the secular thought of the Greeks and the Stoics was introjected into Christianity, which then held it for 1,000 years. It then, and reflected, by the way, and no one reads the simple fact that perhaps the most prominent student of the modern sort of source of freedom is Locke. Locke's work, and I think biographers of Locke have now come around to this idea, is almost accepted, was applied theology. I believe. Now, I don't know how many of you have read Locke's religious writings, but his commentary on the Gospels, which nobody reads, which is very revealing. But it was part of the process of the extroversion, if you like, or whatever the proper word is, in introjection of this powerful Christian, if you like, encapsulation of ancient Greek thought via Paul back into the world. And the same ideas, the same three ideas came, so the idea of, the Galatian idea led to the freedom as, escape from sin, the power of slavery to sin, the idea of freedom as power, but also the idea of the Corpus Christi as is the embodiment of the civic notion of freedom in identity with the Christian community. All those ideas, in fact, can be easily secularized. And in fact, there's another book I'm writing on the early thought of the early modern thought, which draws heavily on these metaphors. But to get so that's in the broadest terms is how it's under. But I liked very much some of the issues you raised. By the way, I love it. I didn't know this quote from Ellen. I see Ellen every month in that we belong to the same society that made up and made real.
Great article.
I love it. I've got to, next time I see her, I say, well, how come you hid this from me all this time? Wow, that's fantastic. But let's get back to the point you raised earlier. Of the demos and because the very earliest, and you're going through language. The very earliest Indo-European word for freedom, which I can't pronounce. Maybe you can. You're a student of language, but anyway, it means literally among the beloved. We who are Denise sort of explores this at great length. It refers to we who are free, as opposed to them, which is often a slave, who are not. It's an us versus them idea. So the original idea does include the slaves, but it's them versus us. So, and the beloved. And I wonder if Toni Morrison knew this, that the most ancient Indo-European meaning of the word freedom is beloved. We the beloved. Yes, it's and who are they and how they are to sort of achieve this relationship with the elite, of course, is the essence of the struggle of Greece from the 7th century, when they were virtually reduced to, they were essentially debt bondage, massive debt bondage, in that sort of early period until the Solonic reforms under the threat of revolt. And, but in a way, I see it dynamically as a struggle, a constant struggle to define precisely what demos means. I mean, and the ways in which the elite define it as opposed to the way in which the mass. It's a very fluid thing, and the different subtle ways in which you define it seems to me reflects where the struggle is at at any given time. And so I find your exploration of this to be really intriguing. And I'd love to read what you have to read about it, because as I said, I'm always open to rethinking. And so the idea for Demos as a slave, though, is simply then more the idea of, it's the slave of God's idea of ultimate freedom, it was found in this sort of, well, the question is, what is the Demos enslaved to? I was just wondering.
The elite.
It's elite. Was it always the elite?
Outside democratia?
Yes.
Yes. The argument is always, or the representation is always, the demos is enslaved to the elite,
yes, or
risks falling back into enslavement by the elite if they don't maintain their democratic institutions.
I see. And that, in a way, is almost an early precursor of the Augustine idea, isn't it? Because he saw enslavement to his genius, to his power, as the sort of security of the Roman freedom. Of course, you may say there's no real freedom there, but it was that idea. But I do find this very intriguing. and must explore it some more. But as you can see, it's the important thing to note is that this singular liberal notion of freedom is so sort of naive, when looked at historically, that okay, we can get back to.
I'm going to
So
nudge us,
you're gonna-
nudge us forward.
We are
so
yes.
that we.
Okay, sorry. I like very much the points you raised about from the Caribbean point of view. I mean, as to what happens after slavery was quote unquote abolished, and the notion of personhood. What kind of person could a free person be? That was the struggle. That was the whole point of the post-colonial period in a way. One solution is, of course, just to move away entirely from any engagement with the former colonial masters who are now colonial. And that was a peasantry. Okay. And the refusal to be engaged with the plantation, because the plantation meant indeed all the problems that you raised. And so the Jamaicans did escape in a way into the present and did recreate a kind of Afro-Jamaican culture, which was the source of much of the vitality of Jamaican culture. It's the source. Bob Marley was a peasant, before he became grew up in the most rural part of the peasantry before he went to Trenchtown and so on. Almost everything that's vital in Jamaican culture emerges from the group which completely removed itself from the plantation. The plantation, on the other hand, as Edith Clarke and many anthropologists of Jamaican remained a kind of neo-slavery system and has been traumatic and for the experience of, and remains so indeed, right through to the modern times. It's a source of turmoil, of endless violence, and so on. So yes, you're absolutely right. The question of what, and the peasantry, of course, was the source of the rejection of the missionaries' attempts to define freedom as sort of becoming Christianized and accepting marriages, those mass marriages which they arranged for the peasants who refused to accept it and throw away their rings and develop their own form of culture. So freedom then becomes the capacity to create one's own culture independently of, and it goes back to my discussion yesterday of ethnocide. Okay, and genocide. I mean, they didn't recognize slavery as a form of genocide. They recognized that. And one form of expression of freedom was the fact that they suddenly started to reproduce right after slavery. But a second form was the fact that they started to recreate their own culture and a vital culture. And those who were not in it remained, in a sense, entrapped in a kind of semi-slavery. That was a plantation. And so you're absolutely right. I mean, the kind of person which was created afterwards, was it the ex-slaves who were going to create it, or was it going to be the missionaries and the continued plantation owners? And I think there's part success in the peasantry, in the culture, but of course, the other part of Jamaica was the one dominated by the continued ex-planters and the elite and the brown skin elite and so on. And the struggle continues in Jamaica, and you can hear it in the dance halls and the nights. It's the ragamuffin, versus the bourgeoisie, and they call themselves, they celebrate their ragamuffin status, as the expression of their freedom. So they fully recognize it as the expression of their personhood, which drives the middle class crazy. So the struggle still continues in Jamaica. In a way, yes. So you're absolutely right. But we can talk some more about that. I think I should stop at this point. But thank you.
It's a wonderful note to turn it open to the audience for questions.
Hi, I'm Dimitri. I'm a second-year history PhD student here. Thank you so much for being here and for sharing this text with us. Reading the David Scott's introduction and part of your interview, I got the sense that the kind of freedom being discussed was primarily understood as an individual freedom with distinctly Western origins, and I guess I'm curious about whether about whether you see a distinction between the kind of freedom that you're describing in your interview with David Scott and forms of collective freedom understood as freedom of a people or a community from various forms of domination, or freedom of a people or a community to form a state or a political organization. And I'm wondering if you think of that kind of collective freedom as different in some way, and whether, if so, whether you also trace it to the this Western lineage of individual freedom, or can we trace other genealogies of freedom that don't necessarily inhere in the individual?
Yes, it's a good point. I'm glad you raised it. I do not mean free states in the sense of independent states, because in that sense, any independent state, even totally barbaric, tyrannical ones, can be said to be free. I mean, so no, I do not mean to use the term in that sense at all, because I don't see Russia as a free state, or any of the number of, or China as a free state. It's free in the sense that it's an independent state, but it's, or North Korea. North Korea is free in that sense, collectively, as they constantly celebrate, but it's freedom. I do not mean freedom in that sense. Although, of course, the struggle for freedom does become tied into the this. I prefer to use the social aspect of freedom, because when I speak of freedom in the third sense, as sort of engagement with freedom in the demos as being an equal part of the demos, there's a collective social element in that. And it's a very important one, by the way. And it's one, well, it's a source of democracy. It's one we're likely to neglect, but you know something, it explains its power, is explaining what's happening right now in America and in the populist revolt all over the world. And let me backtrack a little about how I see these three elements. I see them, I use the metaphor of a chordal triad, and to see them interacting with each other, and that the three require each other. And true freedom, real freedom comes only when the three are sort of working together. But the long history of freedom has been a long struggle in which different groups have tried to extract one from the other. Elites have always sort of emphasized freedom as power. I mean, that's throughout the Middle Ages. You know, one of my favorite examples of this is the sort of the English lords in the 9th century referred to the freedom of gallows, by which they mean the freedom to execute anyone within their domain, which is the extreme of the idea of freedom as power. And obviously that suits them. They are very resistant to the idea of freedom as liberation, independence, freedom from, and of course the idea of freedom as a sort of basically equality in the laws, in the social, whatever the governing social order is, and pride in that. Now, when these become separated, they can become dangerous, and in many ways, what's happening in America? Let's look at the crazy situation, the fraught situation we're in America today. in many ways, the populist rhetoric is very much an appeal to that most, if you like, primeval, then Venetian idea of the freedom as the we, the collective we, who possess this space, this political and social space, which is America. We the people, okay? And the fear that we the people are being invaded by others who are not among the beloved being we white Christian. So that's the definition of what freedom is. It's a real part of the history of freedom, right? And it's the fear that those who are not among the beloved, the Mexicans, the blacks, the immigrants, are going to come into us among the beloved and spoil us. That's not new. That's a profound and deeply rooted, and it goes back to the demos and the attitude, if you like, of the hostility towards the freedmen in Athens. You know, I say, I mean, it's it's remarkable that even though so much of what is great in Greece, the buildings, much of the art, the policemen who kept order, and so they were all slaves and ex-slaves, for Christ's sakes, and but they were never really accepted. Even Aristotle was not accepted. So that precious entity, you had both your parents had to be Greeks and so on, and that idea of a special community of the beloved is what at the core of the, if you like, the social notion of freedom as we among the beloved, we who constitute an equal group and so on. And it becomes dangerous when it's separated from the other notions of freedom. It seems to me, and it's there, I see it. And what do they emphasize? Freedom. They're not, I mean, to say that they don't know what they're talking about, they know what they're talking about. It is one element of freedom, that idea of us belonging to a community which we share, which we're equal members, the beloved, and it doesn't belong to them who are not among us. That has deep, deep roots in the history of freedom, and that's why that's what I mean by freedom. They're not interested in the other two elements. They're not interested in the liberal notion of freedom, and freedom as power, which they also recognize. This is why they're hostile to the elites and so on. So I see this, and I scratch my head at people saying that what's happening, of course, is a fragmentation in America of this triad. If you want to use the the musical metaphor, it's fragmented deeply in America now, and in other parts of the West. In a way, the welfare state, and I don't want to celebrate it, but one definition of the welfare state when it works is indeed the integration of these three notes of the chord. And it still works in part. I don't want to name any society, but when it works very well. And it came very close to working very well in parts of Western Europe. But it's been, I see it as fragmented now. And in America, it's very fragmented. And this is what Trumpism is all about. The appeal to the beloved. Okay, so
hopefully we'll get.
Sorry.
Let's take one more question and maybe another one.
I'm going to be very brief from now on. So please.
Hello, pardon me. Hello, my name is William. I'm a third-year PhD student in geography. As you were talking about freedom, what was coming to my mind is marriage, and particularly the gendered forms of marriage. So I study West Africa, but also parts of the Caribbean. And what I found very interesting is when you look at gendered marriage and you look at some of the kind of slave narratives or dialogues, that a lot of the kind of female slaves were conceptualizing freedom or marriage in terms of being reconnected to family or escaping sexual violence, whereas a lot of the male slaves were conceptualizing freedom or marriage in terms of the absence of chains. It was kind of more abstract. So you see there's a gendered note behind marriage. And so I was interested in your thoughts on that and gendered freedom and gendered marriage, particularly, and you mentioned yesterday, gendercide or feminicide. And the second question to this is, as you were talking, I was thinking about Trullo's Silencing the Past and his comment on the Basals and the Congolese and the Haitian Revolution, and how they conceptualized freedom for them was living on the sides of mountains and having food sovereignty.
And having what?
Food sovereignty, farming themselves. Yeah. And so I'm thinking about this gender conception of freedom and then this almost ecological food sovereignty, as it were, and how you kind of conceptualize or move between them in your work.
Yeah. Well, one of my early works is on marriage, is, the early history of the slave revolts in Jamaica and leading to the often called the First Maroon Wars. And Jamaica, as you know, has made a national hero of Nanny. It was one of the leader of the Maroons. The problem is we don't know very much about Nanny, but she, except that she was a great leader. And as I said earlier, I entirely agree. I mean, the peasants Jamaican peasants withdrawing to the hills and developing their own peasant communities was core idea for them. Freedom meant that independence, even if it meant only a half acre of land. But they could produce, and it's amazing to see what you can produce and how you can feed a family of 6.5 acres of land. But that was freedom in every sense of the term to them. Economic freedom, political freedoms, and individual freedom. I would need to know more. There is no doubt from the history of slavery that one of the central features of slavery everywhere was rape. And the rape of women, and Frederick Douglass, in a famous passage point out the worst fate could befall a slave woman is to be even mildly attractive, because she'd almost certainly end. But rape as an essential part of slavery is now is, I think, fairly generally accepted. And so for women, one can see that as critical in defining what their freedom is. And my novel, Died a Long Day, in fact, that was central to the theme of the novel, because her rebellion is based on the fact that she didn't want her daughter to be raped by the overseer. But look, it gets more complicated in a way in which, to get back to what I mentioned yesterday, many people don't like to talk about, because there were tensions between those views of what freedom is. Because unfortunately, the slaveholders' view of freedom as domination carried over into the slave community. Now, we don't want to, in writing, usable past. I don't like that term, actually. I think it's very bourgeois. But you know what it means, right? Okay, in writing a usable past is great if you're telling the truth about what exactly happened. One of the tragedies is that freedom as domination of others over whom you exercise control was carried over into the slave quarters. The slave drivers were pretty vicious within the slave system. Men, in their attempts over women, they didn't quite succeed. Was also carried over this idea of freedom as domination. I'm free to the degree that I can exercise power over anyone, whether it's my children, whom I can beat the way I was beaten, or the women whom I can exercise my freedom over by being powerful. And women, of course, obviously powerfully resisted this and continued to resist it, and would rather be not married, and in fact, then be married or have a relationship in that situation. And this, by the way, single parenting started from very early, constitutes an expression of female freedom in important respects, because they know that marriage or even a continued relationship with a man often means a carryover. The idea of freedom as power over, when for her, freedom means freedom both in a negative sense and in the sense of power, in the sense of directing my life, empowerment. That's the other sort of, by the way, there's a brutal and a benign aspect of the idea of freedom as power. The brutal aspect is just the slave master's view. Freedom means power over. And it's also the capitalist view, power over. My ability to, by the stroke of a pen, sort of disemploy thousands of people, destroy a whole town, and so that's power. And that's freedom. Support to have that freedom recognized, as opposed to the freedom which is empowerment. And Amartya Sen develops this idea very much. He thought he was being very original. In fact, well, in a way, I guess he was, but in capability. He goes a great length of a notion of capability, and I keep scratching my head and thinking, okay, that's very, very original. But it's the idea of freedom as power in the sense of capability, self-direction, empowerment, which women have always emphasized in describing it, and which is different from the power of power over versus power over others as opposed to power over oneself, and so on, is the critical distinction between male and female views of freedom, and it runs right through the history. And you certainly find it in Jamaica if you talk to women who have now given up completely on, most working class women have given up completely on marriage for exactly this reason. I want the power to direct myself, and I won't get it in relationship with a man. So I don't want to stray too much in this area because it gets very contentious, and it doesn't gel with the idea of the use of a past, which is the bourgeois idea. If I want to have a past which I can boast about and which is part of the great empires and whatever you and so on, whatever they want to call it. But the real past involves a real struggle. And it has to do with these different dimensions of freedom and what freedom really means. Okay, but you're right, there's a gendered view of freedom, and several people have written brilliantly on this. And I love the work of Judith Butler on this, her work on Antigone, which, by the way, uses social death in a way in which I must say was more original than anything I could have thought of. I mean, I love her stuff, as it keeps saying, carry on, carry on. This is my favorite example of Sartre's in his great book, What is Literature? It's a great little book. Every person student of literature should read What is Literature. But the central idea there is that when a writer writes something and puts it out into the world, it's only half finished. It's finished by the reader, who then can create with it what they want. So Judith Butler does great things with sort of social death, which I love. The Afro-pessimists do interesting things with the idea of social death, and I'm not going to complain because I just sort of retreat to the Sartrean view. Well, okay, you're completing it in that way. It may not be my way, but I have no claims anymore.
So
Yeah.
we're almost to the final moment. So how many questions remain out there? But if there's only one, then we'll take one last question, or we could take two. Let's take two together, and then you'll get one final word, and then the rest will be finished by the reader.
Right.
The question I was hearing raised by Will and Dimitri in various ways was what to do with freedom in the non-modern West. And I wanted to return that to I thought it was a brilliant exchange between you and Professor Cammack, and especially your elaboration of the ancient, but I thought the way you took it to the reception through late antiquity was especially great.
Yeah.
So we know that by the time we come to the Eastern Mediterranean later on, I mean, Islam itself is surrender, and it has a conception of freedom very radically, and equally in Eastern Christianity, it's a doulos to theo, as you say, taking from Paul, but really taking that. There's even these amazing depictions of Christ Pantocrator, the all-powerful, is the frescoes of God that are common in Eastern Christianity. So the question is what to do with that, to describe it as freedom or as forms of unfreedom. So and here I'm thinking, I feel like if we take your thesis seriously, and as I understood it from the interview and also in this exchange, these are all variations on a theme of freedom, because in part it is taken from ancient conceptions and elaborated in different ways throughout this history.
Yeah.
I would contrast that with just because last week we had the privilege of having Mahmoud Mamdani visit, and he offered kind of the opposite view, which is, but in a way it's the same. That's why I'm not sure where you stand on it. He said that freedom and slavery are modern. They emerge together. They emerge with capitalism through modernity in what we understand, through secularization, et cetera, and actually in most of the world, for most of the time, i.e. the non-modern West, by and large, people were neither free nor enslaved, but in various ways existing in states of unfreedom. So for me, these are two contrasting ways of taking seriously the kinds of things we raised in discussions between Professor Cammack and with the other people. Like, I don't know whether to understand Maronage or Islam or things like that as variations on freedom, or as varying kinds of unfreedom. If we want to take seriously the idea that it's in the West that freedom and slavery come together, which it seems at stake there is also your comment, Professor Rosenthal, the idea of capitalism with its clothes off, that it's coexistent with modernity and liberalism and capitalism. It seems like that might be something we want to save, but on the other hand, it also, if we go that route, it seems to maintain the primacy of the West as that to which everything else has to be compared, and it seems to not to neglect the idea of thinking from those other perspectives. So I don't know. I would like to hear what you have to say.
Okay.
Oh, cool. I wanted to ask, sort of in the interview that we read, there's a lot of emphasis on thinking about the persistence of freedom and why the term has stuck over such a long period of time, and also sort of thinking about it in a dialectical relationship with slavery or with the construction of the other. So my question was, in the contemporary moment, is it possible for us to sort of shake freedom free of its dialectical connection to slavery or the other or the dominated, through a contemporary struggle to sort of re-articulate and reimagine the term? And if it's not, as people who are thinking, political actors in the world today, should we turn to something else, another term like liberation?
Yeah. Those are two great questions, and I could spend a week on each one. I don't know, I can be brief, but they're really, okay. Let me start with the second one. Second question. My answer simply is no, we can't. It is what it is, as Naipaul would say. Meaning, so I do not see ideas in any Platonic sense out there, which can be discovered or either in the hearts of men and women or out there in the Platonic ether to be found. And if we don't like that, we go searching in the ether to find something else. That's not how ideas emerge socio-historically. And I use I pointed out something I learned from Aristotle, funnily enough, about how he talks about how ideas in a way, almost emerged from the real world, from people didn't use the term struggle, but I'd say it's from struggle, and people in making sense of it come up with some idea of what it is they're struggling over. And what happens, he said, the wise then pick up on these ideas. And among the things they do is to imagine that were the first to imagine it, but in fact it's not. And then you have a dialect. The history of an idea then, of a thought, is the history of that dialectic between this sort of real people sort of struggling over the meaning of this thing, the wise telling them what it is, having derived it from them. And so you have two parts continuing and constantly feeding in each other and reinforcing each other. But the arrogance of the philosophical and intellectual mind is often that we were the ones who discovered it, and we can sit in our armchair like Isaiah Berlin and discuss what freedom is. And negative freedom is the only freedom. And no, that's how philosophers do it, and they can continue to get paid to do it, so they can continue doing it what they want. But the point, that's not how it works. How it works is in this dialectical way between real struggle and thinking. So the most you can do is continue the dialogue as a thinker, or also as an actor, or both. I see myself as both, and try to make sense of it and try to direct it. Otherwise, you go find some other concept which you may want to promote. So that would be my idea. No, you can't. We're stuck with that freedom, with that history, and that is what it is. And we can do all kinds of tricks. We can do what liberalism tried to do and say it's only the negative part and so on. We can say it's only among the beloved and so on and so forth. But whatever, you're going to continue with that. Otherwise, you find, as other people have done. And so this takes me to your first. No, I don't. So here's the funny. I keep getting myself into situations where I'm being confounded with reactionaries because people don't understand the radicalism of what I'm saying. So it's a difficult situation. So one of the criticisms I get for being conservative is that, hey, Patterson, you were just sort of saying that this great idea of freedom was existed in the West and it didn't exist in other freedom. And that's a chauvinistic way of viewing the world. Freedom existed everywhere and so on. In a way, Amartya, whom I love, and he's a great man, partly accused me of this, but he claims that freedom exists in India, and his example is some Muslim person who sort of set free some of his slaves or something. But look, to the contrary, I think I'm offering a very radical interpretation, not a chauvinistic. Yes, it originated in the West. And no, other people have great ideas of their own. Okay, whether it's nirvana or whatever. I mean, different cultures emphasize things which are central to their society. The irony is that people are saying, other people have freedom too, in a sense. They've been so sort of bemused by the West that they're insisting that an idea which is very Western must have existed elsewhere. No, it was diffused elsewhere. And the Chinese are right. And by the way, it's very interesting. Anyway, they're resisting translation. Someone has translated freedom into Chinese, and the Chinese are trying to figure out whether they're going to have it published or not. But anyway, but they have insisted, rightly, there's a famous conference in Bangkok in 1993, after this sort of big celebration, that the idea after the fall of the Soviet Union, you remember what that freedom has triumphed, remember that? And that's when this fellow wrote about the last man and whatnot. And everyone thought this. And so there was this celebratory conference, which the UN arranged, you're too young to remember, in Bangkok, and in which the whole world was going to come. And with the mantle of the world on the fact that freedom, we're all free, Lordy, Lordy. And the Chinese turned up and said, we've got other ideas. And a strange collection of people, the Chinese, the Singaporeans, and And I think the Indonesians and a few others said, no, this is not our idea. Or anyway, we have notions of it, like the development, that, you know, getting rid of poverty as being sort of critical to that. It is a fascinating conference. Everybody was shocked because the West was so full of itself that its idea had triumphed over the world, that it was assumed that everybody would sign on to the fact that the world is free, which is not true. And I think I'm on the side of the Chinese here. They're absolutely right. It's a Western idea. And to accuse me of being conservative and saying that this is so, it's just fascinating. But it did evolve. And however, the way in which it evolved is one, you know, so while people may, on the one hand say, conservatives may say, oh yeah, we like that idea that it originated in the ancient West. They don't like the idea when I explain how it originated. That this dialectic, that the reason why it emerged was not just the existence of slavery, but something else which emerged first in the ancient West. And it's a distinction with Moses Finley, the great Moses Finley often made, a distinction between slave society and slave-holding societies. Slave-holding societies exist everywhere, in China everywhere. There are some slaves and so on, in Africa everywhere. Slave society, that extraordinary thing in which a society becomes powerfully dependent economically and socially and politically on slavery as central to its existence, emerged historically. It was a historically unique event, and it emerged among the ancient Greeks for the first time. And the evidence is quite powerful. I mean, you know, slavery existed long before in the ancient Near East. It existed in China, it existed in Korea, it existed in Japan, but they never became slave societies. The phenomenon of slave society emerged in ancient Greece, and I tried to trace the history there in Freedom in Making a Western Culture. And then, of course, in Rome, it metastasized into the greatest slave society of all time, which the world has never seen, not even modern slavery, because slavery permeated the entire system except the army. Okay, the economy was run by slaves. You know, I mean, you read Cicero if you don't believe me. I mean, you know, I mean, the bureaucracy was run by the teachers. If you want a teacher, you go buy a Greek teacher. You know, and the imperial bureaucracy, and even the advisors to the emperor doing, you know, the Claudian section. So that system, the world had never seen anything like that before, and it will never see anything like that again. Even the modern slave societies were nothing like that, in which the system totally permeated by slavery. That is uniquely Western. And the important thing to note is that at all the great points in Western history, we find this perverse institution. Over and over, we find it in ancient Greece, and then it pops up again 500 years in Rome. But you know something, I mean, we think of the end of Rome as the end of slavery. That's not true. You know, Michael McCormick's great work, of course, has abolished the whole notion of the Dark Ages. It no longer exists. It's now lit up. And I belong to an organization of Harvard called the Science of the Human Past, in which the use of modern sort of science, both in archaeology, study of the history of the weather, the history of diseases, have led us to reinterpret the fall of Rome, you know, I mean, and all the rest. But anyway, McCormick's great book shows that, in fact, that whole notion of the fall of Rome, and then things went sunk into, you know, quiescence, but it's all wrong. That slavery was alive and well in, you know, Merovingian France, that it rose again in the 10th century. The reason why in all of European languages, the only word, no matter what the European family of language, in which has the root Slav in all the languages, is because, and you should know this, because I often hear it said that, you know, one of the characteristic features of modern slavery is that it became identified with one racial group. Black people. Hey, that's not true. It happened before, at least once, with a group of people called Slavs. And that's why whether it's Swedish or French or Spanish or Hungarian has the same root. In fact, they're a very different family of languages. Slavery, or the idea emerged from what? The Slavs were the first group. But more importantly, when Europe rose again, and move it away from, because, China, which is the leading, the most advanced country, up to about, well, they're in now the Great Transition. But the idea then is somewhere around 1730 or 40 is when the West moved away from China. How did they do it? They turned to slavery. And, as you know, the slavery and capitalism as our twins are essential. So this civilization is strange from this point of view. It's the only civilization which, at all its high points, has emphasized slavery as central to its development. And those of you following the history will know that Sven Beckert and others are going on about slavery and capitalism, but they kind of get it wrong in that it happened much earlier, and I wish they'd celebrate Eric Williams a little more, but it started in the West Indies. So what I'm saying is that this is a unique history like nowhere else. And in a sense, that dialectical relationship between slavery and freedom is how I got to it. I blundered into it. I didn't it's not a hypothesis I had. I don't work that way. I didn't have a hypothesis. Hey, freedom emerged from slavery. It was very grounded. I mean, it popped up there and I couldn't believe it. That this indeed was the case. And it was reinforced throughout by the continuing existence of slavery or slave-like institutions such as serfdom. So I've gone on some length because it's so irritating to hear people misinterpret what I think is a very radical, critical interpretation of Western culture as one in which I'm supposed to be sort of defending a very traditional, conservative view of the West as being the glorifying sort of origins of great ideas. It's the origin of freedom, but freedom itself is an idea worth probing very deeply. And you may not think it's so great. I happen to think it is, but I think it's important to recognize that, yes, and I'm never going to back down from this, that it is Western. It is originated in the West. And to the degree that it's found elsewhere, it's been diffused. And there is the history strikes me as being sort of very, very powerful in favor. I find no evidence of the idea of freedom as value. Now, look, guys, I mean, the idea of freedom.
I think this is
just one final word. The idea of freedom is a simple one, especially the negative one, which people must have talked about from some time or the other. But that's not the point. The idea of freedom as value, an essential value, that's the point I'm making here, is unique to the West. I mean, every other culture. As a matter of fact, there's one exercise you can do, especially those of you in language, which I got my students from Korea, China, and elsewhere. The nice thing, especially, you can do this at Berkeley. Get them to look at the etymology. All languages now have the word for freedom, okay? So, but did not have it before Western contact. So one interesting exercise you can do is to go and search for the etymology of the word in a particular language. You're in for a shock. And my favorite example, of course, is the Japanese notion of freedom, which the original meaning is something like, it's something distasteful. It means irresponsibility or something like that. In all the languages, if you go back to the etymology, it's often seen as something, and then of course later on, people think, oh, I see. That's my friend. So I see I see the typical situation of a missionary having lived for 40 years in the heart of China and not converted a single person to Christianity, decide, okay, before I go back home, I'm going to write a dictionary. So, you know, you sit down, you go to this Chinese peasant and, okay, so tell me what dog means or what the dogs, and what about freedom? And what do you mean? No, freedom? That it's written in your heart. You must know what it means, or something to that effect. What is it? So the peasant will say, well, you know, I'm not quite sure. We don't have a word, but tell me what you are getting at. And so the missionary tells the person this wonderful word. Oh, well, that sounds like irresponsibility. And you know, one gets this everywhere. And so the word freedom is everywhere now, but in fact, the original response to it is really quite startling if you go back to the etymology. So yes, it's Western. I'm never going to back down from that, but you know, but how? And that's a different story. Anyway.
With that bit of radical etymology, let's thank Professor Patterson. Thank you.